Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue. Alors, on va débuter. Mon nom est Guillaume Sirois, je suis professeur ici au département de sociologie de l'Université de Montréal. Et donc, c'est à moi que revient l'honneur d'ouvrir cet événement avec le professeur Tony Bennett pour une conférence donc intitulée Museums, Governance and the Politics of Truth. Comme son nom l'indique, donc la conférence sera en anglais. On va d'abord entendre le professeur Bennett et ensuite on a prévu évidemment une période d'échange avec lui. Si pendant la période d'échange vous souhaitez intervenir en français, je pourrais faire la traduction. Enfin, peut-être pas mot à mot de ce que vous aurez dit, mais transmettre l'esprit en anglais. Avant de débuter, j'aimerais faire une reconnaissance territoriale. Donc, je souhaite reconnaître que l'Université de Montréal est située en territoire autochtone, lequel n'a jamais été cédé. Je reconnais que la nation Gagnen-Guéaga, comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur laquelle nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui, Tiohtià:ke. Montréal est historiquement connu comme un lieu de rassemblement pour les nombreuses Premières Nations et aujourd'hui une population autochtone diversifiée ainsi que d'autres peuples y résident. C'est dans le respect des liens avec le passé, le présent et l'avenir que nous reconnaissons les relations continues entre les peuples autochtones et autres personnes des communautés montréalaises. Alors, pour organiser cet événement, j'ai évidemment quelques remerciements à faire puisqu'on a été plusieurs à s'y mettre. Donc, j'aimerais d'abord évidemment remercier la Chaire Fernand-Dumont sur la culture, puisque le professeur Tony Bennett est l'invité d'honneur d'une conférence qui débutera dans quelques jours, plus précisément les 18 et 19 mai à l'INRS. La conférence est intitulée « Les dynamiques de participation artistique et culturelle contemporaine à l'aune de l'immigration, regard atlantique ». Également, donc, à participer à l'organisation, le laboratoire Arts et Société, Terrain et Théorie, aussi basé à l'INRS, duquel je suis membre, comme plusieurs autres chercheurs associés à l'événement de ce soir. La Faculté des Arts et des Sciences de l'Université de Montréal, la FAS, et le Centre d'exposition de l'Université de Montréal qui nous reçoit ce soir. Je tiens particulièrement à remercier Laurent Vernet, son directeur, pour l'aide à l'organisation de l'événement d'aujourd'hui. Et finalement, un dernier partenaire, la Chaire de recherche du Canada en muséologie citoyenne. Et donc, sa titulaire, Johanne Lamoureux, est assise à la table avec nous, puisque elle nous reçoit elle aussi. Et donc, je lui cède tout de suite la parole.
Merci, Guillaume. Quelques mots un peu pour situer la place et la résonance de cette conférence-là dans le programme des activités annuelles du partenariat dans lequel la Chaire est impliquée, qui est un partenariat sur les nouveaux usages des collections et qui chaque année organise des conférences. Alors, on a été ravis de s'associer, d'avoir l'occasion de s'associer à cet événement. Et pour tous ceux qui, comme moi, ont eu le plaisir de commencer à lire Tony Bennett il y a presque 30 ans, il peut paraître absolument paradoxal de se réjouir autant d'accueillir ce soir quelqu'un qui n'a pas été tendre pour les collections et l'histoire des collections, puisqu'il a littéralement fondé son récit de la naissance du musée sur une rupture qui rompait justement, qui instaurait une distance avec ce qui constituait et qui constitue encore dans la tradition francophone, je dois dire, le récit dominant de la naissance du musée, à savoir différentes manières de collectionner, dont le nom change et dont on discute sans fin la typologie. Pour lui, justement, le musée est lié au complexe exhibitionnaire. Et donc, c'est intéressant aujourd'hui, au moment où on met une réflexion qui n'est pas une réflexion historique sur le musée, mais qui l'engage par rapport à des enjeux contemporains, de voir et de l'entendre pour s'interroger. Je sais que je reconnais beaucoup de visages, donc qui, dans le cadre de leur réflexion muséologique, seront intéressés à le faire, pour s'interroger donc sur ce que veut dire, ce que peuvent vouloir dire les collections dans le contexte qu'évoquera Tony Bennett. Donc, merci à Laurent, merci à Guillaume et merci à vous parmi nous.
Juste avant de céder la parole au professeur Bennett, quelques petites notes pour vous le présenter plus formellement. Donc, Tony Bennett est professeur émérite à la Western Sydney University depuis 2020, puisqu'il a fait une grande partie de sa carrière. Il a été associé longtemps au Institute for Culture and Society, dont il a été le directeur pendant de nombreuses années. Évidemment, centre très important pour les Cultural Studies en Australie, et dont plusieurs d'entre vous et moi, bien sûr, suivons les travaux. Les travaux du professeur Bennett sont très vastes, touchent un ensemble de préoccupations, les études muséales, évidemment, dont il nous parlera aujourd'hui, mais plus largement les études culturelles, la sociologie de la culture et l'étude critique des politiques culturelles. Si vous avez la chance d'aller l'entendre à la fin de la semaine à l'INRS, vous allez voir qu'il va parler d'un tout autre sujet. Donc, ça montre bien tout l'étendue de ces préoccupations, mais des recherches qui sont, j'oserais dire, tissées autour du fil rouge des liens complexes qui unissent culture et exercice du pouvoir. Donc, il a un nombre très impressionnant d'ouvrages, d'articles, de chapitres. Je n'en ferai pas la liste, mais je tiens à en nommer quelques-uns. Johanne l'a déjà nommé, un de ses livres certainement les plus connus dans les études muséales, c'est bien sûr The Birth of the Museum, History, Theory, Politics, paru en 1995. Et plus récemment, en 2018, Museum Power and Knowledge, Selected Essays. Donc, ça nous montre bien l'étendue de son regard sur les musées. Beaucoup d'autres ouvrages que sans doute plusieurs d'entre vous avez lus. Et je veux en nommer un dernier, but I'll do it in English. Culture, a Reformer Science, because this is the first book of you that I've read as a PhD student. It was really important in my own intellectual trajectory. So it's a real honor for me to welcome you at Université de Montréal. So please welcome Professor Tony Bennett.
Thank you for those introductions. My thanks to Lauren for his help in bringing this together. And I don't know where she is now, but to Caroline for the wonderful hospitality and organization that she's shown in getting myself and other colleagues here. Okay, so to situate what I wanted to say, today's social, political, and environmental crises present museums with a daunting set of challenges as they are called on to respond to many urgencies, those of climate change and, in particular, the increasing force of Indigenous critiques. The current pace of debates and of new and emergent practices around these issues is too rapid and the issues themselves too diffuse for me to pretend to be up to speed with all of them. I'm going to first look over the shoulders of two art historians whose recent studies focused on different moments in and aspects of the relations between the discipline of art history and the practices of museums will illustrate the issues that are flagged by the relations between the three key terms of my title: museums, governance, and the politics of truth. These three terms are all in play in the connections that Josephine Berry makes in her Art and Bare Life, the connections that she makes between the initiation of a systematic approach to art history in the work of Johann Winkelmann and the development of new forms of biopower that partially displaced earlier forms of sovereign power. These connections are especially prominent in the role she attributes to the new types of museum collections that were accumulated across the course of the 18th century in relationship to both of these developments. Biopower, briefly summarized to remind you, seeks to act on the conducts of humans in terms of their interactions with other species and other forms of life in shared environments. As such, the perspective of biopower shattered earlier conceptions of humans as, quoting Berry, God's preformed creatures whose essential attributes were held to be divinely given. Berry argues that the developments in evolutionary theory, which underpinned the formulations of biopower, had been made possible only by the unparalleled explosion in the collection of organic specimens in the newly developing museums of the natural history that characterized the late 18th century. Only this, she says, made it possible to see human life in the context of its environmentally mediated relations with other forms of life. Similarly, she contends that Winckelmann's conception of art as an integrated system was only made possible by the 18th century rush of archaeological digs, which allowed fragments of ancient Greco-Roman culture to be assembled in private collections. In both cases, the new conception of life as a trans-species unity, so human and animal life seen together, and of art as a systematic whole spanning different societies and historical periods, depended, she argued, on the separation of entities from, respectively, the natural and social worlds and their assembly in the curated space of museums. This also, Berry argues, nurtured the emergence of modern conceptions of art's autonomy, dismantling its earlier religious, well, not dismantling but entirely, but anyway, displacing, modifying its earlier religious and ritual uses through art's construction as a distinctive sensible milieu comprised by the coexistence of works extracted from different contexts and brought together in a range of private and public collections. It was only this, she argues, that made art available as a means for acting on the conduct of different human populations in the context of their relations to one another and to other forms of life in interacting natural and social environments. All right, so I'm going to come back to that later, just hold the thoughts. My second example is from Susan Ballard's Art and Nature in the Anthropocene, Planetary Aesthetics, which also proposes a radical rereading of the relations between museums, art history, and the relations between human and natural life on Earth. The project of a planetary aesthetics that Ballard proposes explores the role that art and its curation might play in relation to the inextricable entanglements of human and natural life on Earth within the long durée of geological time in the context of the already manifest catastrophes of climate change and species loss. And the image that she proposes to kind of like crystallize these concerns is one from the Australian environmentalist Deborah Bird's Rose's book, Wild Dog Dreaming, in which she talks about a photo. The photo I'm going to talk about now is not this one, but another, it's in this book. But Ballard talks about a photo of a dingo strung up and left for dead on a barbed wire fence. It's not just the photo of the dingo that matters there, but the fact that underneath the dingo, there is a pile of debris from past dingo killings that is piled up at its feet, signaling that it is not just the loss of a single life that is at issue, but, Ballard argues, accumulating loss of life threatening species extinction and environmental degradation arising out of the dynamics of settler colonialism. So Ballard's project of a planetary aesthetics then is one which seeks to distill the rationale for the new forms of art's action on human conduct required to avert the impending catastrophes that confront us, a rationale arising out of the new politics of truth comprised by the rethinking of human, species, environment entanglements emerging from the debates occasioned by the concept of the Anthropocene, even though that concept's a bit up for grabs and debate. Okay, so these are a couple of examples then of current debates in which the relations between museums, questions of governance, and politics of truth are in play. So I'll come back to these after I have reviewed some of the ways in which I've approached these and some related issues in different aspects of my work on museums. And I'll begin with the work that I heard Guillaume refer to, The Birth of the Museum, which published some time ago in 1995, was 2 lines of inquiry that I'd begun in the 1980s, at the time when, in the lead up to Australia's 1988 bicentennial celebrations, questions concerning the politics of the past were strongly present in Australian public debates. Just as an anecdote, I mean, I'm British originally, and I was never in the least interested in museums when I lived in Britain. But when I moved to Australia in the 1980s, wow, there was a politics of museums that was really, just right in your face. So in engaging with these questions, I also sought to relate them to the longer histories comprised by the emergence of the public museum in Europe and its subsequent global expansion through colonial networks. And the main theoretical lens through which I broached these questions, and through which I continue to broach them, was that provided by Michel Foucault's construction of the relations between truth and power, not as opposites, but as things that work together. And the key questions I asked were, what forms of truth shaped the 19th century development of public museums? What kinds of power did these forms of truth constitute and exercise? How have these shaped and been reshaped by the subsequent histories of museums? So there's an essay in The Birth of the Museum called The Exhibitionary Complex, which provided a kind of conceptual umbrella for the book's overarching concerns in seeking to identify the distinctive forms of truth-power relations the public museum instantiated by considering the 19th century development of the public museum alongside that of a series of other institutions, the prison, other apparatuses of civic instruction like libraries, and international exhibitions and fairs were the main ones. The most important of these, in that essay at any rate, consisted in the contrast that I drew between the trajectories of the museum and the prison, the public museum and the prison. The latter in Michel Foucault's famous analysis of the new logics of punishment associated with the 19th century conception of the museum, of the prison rather, as a penitentiary. He did not think of the museum as a penitentiary, that would be clear. His conception of the 19th century conception of the prison as a penitentiary as one which withdrew the scene of punishment from the place that it had earlier occupied as a public spectacle through which sovereign power was made manifest. Instead, as you'll recall, punishment was increasingly conducted behind the closed walls of the penitentiary as a means of reforming the offender through the application of new techniques of disciplinary power. So what interested me is that if for Foucault's analysis, punishment thus moved from the public domain to the enclosed settings from which the public was excluded, the development of the public museum represented a movement in the opposite direction, a move away from the socially restricted and enclosed domains that had characterized the earlier histories of cabinets of curiosities and of royal and aristocratic collections, as these were progressively, albeit cautiously, opened up and made accessible to the general publics of emerging democracies as part of a wider set of new kinds of public cultural institutions, national galleries, science museums, public libraries, and the like. But if public museums differed from prisons in terms of both their openness to a general public and their transformation of diversionary forms of public spectacle into improving forms of public instruction, they nevertheless also exercised forms of disciplinary power, and they still do. Various technologies, the rules and prescriptions regarding appropriate behavior within the museum, the use of guards and guides, were used to regulate the behavior of the museum's expanded publics, warding off the concern that making museums freely accessible to unrestricted publics might expose them, the museums, to unseemly forms of behavior that would detract from their civilizing influence. These were also complemented by other ways of regulating behavior borrowed from other institutional settings. Museums were like public parks, places in which working class visitors were expected to acquire better public manners, more civilized ways of comporting themselves in public contexts, through the occasion offered for commingling with the middle classes. There's a couple of pictures here from what was a very influential conception of museums in mid-19th century Britain, that they would form an antidote to public drunkenness. So there's the museum here as, on the one hand, you've got Sunday afternoon in a London gin palace with working class people getting drunk and what have you. But then they go to Sunday afternoon in a picture gallery where they're exposed to the improving influence of the middle class. This was absolutely a major source of the inspiration of Henry Cole, who was the director of the British exhibition, the Great Exhibition of 1851, and the founder of the South Kensington Museum. But the architectural organization of relationships of space and vision in museums also worked as they did in the penitentiary to regulate behavior, but in different ways and to different effect. The oligoptic arrangement of lines of sight within 19th century museums, let's say oligoptic as in the sense of who is watched and who is watching, exchanging positions with one another. The oligoptic arrangement of lines of sight within 19th century museums complemented the disciplinary function of museum guards by organizing relations of reciprocal self-watching through which the museum visitor was subjected to the controlling gaze of other visitors. These lines of sight differed significantly from the disciplinary optics of the penitentiary, in which, in accordance with the logic of the panopticon, the prisoner was subjected to the unseen gaze of a distant power. In the museum, by contrast, the visitor was free to move between the position of observer and observed, watcher and watched, with great kind of like consequences for the conduct of visitors within the museum. So this was a contrast that I drew upon between the scenes of the people in the late 19th century Museum of Natural Curiosities. Well, as you can see, not a great deal of respect for the items on display, to this scene, the Bethnal Green Museum in 1876, where, I don't know whether you can see it clearly, but there are balconies going along there in which there are the visitors on the higher levels. Balconies are watching down on the people below, and people will exchange spaces. So you know you're being watched, but you're being watched by your peers, so to speak. So these aspects of museums resonated with those associated with the development of a parallel set of institutions, including, so far as their architectural arrangements were concerned, department stores. These had similar kind of arrangements. And with regard to their social purpose, public libraries, in conjoining the imagery of engineering and civics, in being conceived as, and this was a very popular term in the mid-19th century for public libraries and museums and art galleries, civic engines. But they were civic engines designed specifically to work on and reform the working classes, the working poor. These 19th century developments constituted a step change in the form of the museum's publicness. The seizure of the Louvre, of course, in the name of the people in the midst of the French Revolution, is often cited as the founding moment of the modern public museum. And while there can be no doubting its significance, its innovations were in some respects quite limited. Its appropriation in the name of a democratic citizenry did not give rise to any notable attempt to make the art on display democratically accessible. There was no attempt to instruct the museum's new publics in how to read and interpret the art displayed any more than the Louvre was open to popular arts rooted in the everyday lives of the people. The scripts of the Louvre, in short, remained those of sovereignty, albeit that what they did was notionally install the citizen in the place of the sovereign. The Great Exhibition that was held in London in 1851 was more significantly transformative in a number of ways. First, it symbolized a key moment in the reordering of museum scripts that had been underway earlier in the century across a broad spectrum of museum disciplines, as these effected an evolutionary ordering of species, artifacts, races, and civilizations. The disciplines that ruled the roost in museums and international exhibitions from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century aimed at what I call the representation of a type and its insertion in a developmental sequence for display to a public. The transition from what Foucault called the orders of classification that governed 18th century natural history collections, orders of classification that were kind of like static, okay, to the evolutionary ordering of the histories of the earth and of the forms of life on earth associated with mid to late 19th century developments in geology and biology, were paralleled by the emergence of a developmental disposition in the disciplines of art history, archaeology, and anthropology. In different ways in different countries, I should add, but nonetheless, this development was transformative and very broadly shared across the course of the 19th century. Brought increasingly under the influence of evolutionary thought, these disciplines reshaped the static orders of 18th century classification into a historicized order of peoples, forms of life, cultures, and things that was shaped by the idea of developmental time, in thus being retooled to operate as machineries of progress. Their political effects consisted in the different positions they assigned different raced, classed, and gendered populations within the progressive course of evolution. Okay, so these then, in rough summary, are the perspectives informing my arguments in The Birth of the Museum. Whatever their merits, however, it soon became clear to me that they failed to take adequate account of the increasing prominence of indigenous critiques of Western museum practices. And this was, looking back on it, most evident in the book's engagement with the debates that were current in the 1980s regarding how earlier museum representations of the Australian past might be renovated in ways that would play productively into the politics of the present. So some of the issues that I looked at were the politics of what was called at the time the new nationalism, oriented to the production of an Australian past that would stand free of its colonial tutelage to Britain, or looking at a class politics that would shape an urban and industrial past in contrast to the pastoral heritage traditions fostered by Australia's colonizing settlers, feminist critiques of the male centrism of the Australian war memorials, presentation of Australia's military history, and multicultural critiques of white Australia. And I also dealt with indigenous critiques of the bicentennial celebrations of 1988. But these latter critiques, the indigenous critiques of the bicentenary, that were loud, vocal, and very public, generated the momentum for more sustained indigenous critiques that have since cut deeply into the histories of the museum form as such, laying bare its constitutively racist and colonial histories, not just in Australia, of course, but in the United States, New Zealand, Canada. In all of these places, indigenous critiques are forced onto today's critical agendas are the operations of a museum system which, from its origins, has been shaped by its articulations across the relations between metropolitan powers and colonial territories, and within colonial territories, the relations between the occupying powers, the dispossession of indigenous peoples, and their subjection to various forms of illiberal government. So these then are the questions that I like to put center stage in a subsequent study, Past Beyond Memory, Evolution, Museums, Colonialism. This qualifies the perspectives that I put forward in The Birth of the Museum in two main ways. First, it pays more attention to the ways in which the evolutionary disposition of the museum disciplines of geology, archaeology, and so on operated in different national settings. In discussing the British context, it argued that the functioning of these disciplines needed to be considered in relation to the broader social influence of evolutionary conceptions on 19th century conceptions of character. Owing to a series of developments across the disciplines of natural history, geology, and prehistoric archaeology, which pushed back the vistas of both human history and the history of the earth further and further back, displacing the shortened time frame of the Mosaic calendar to produce deep time as something that was entirely new, at least in Western culture, because of course indigenous critiques now lay claim to different forms of deep time and having had it for longer. However, so this production of a new deep time within Western culture, and in my case, particularly within British culture, also provided new coordinates for a series of interventions into governing how people acted in view of how they were placed to think about and envisage and enact their relations to time. In Britain, this was connected to the historicization of character through which each person was held to have been formed by the accumulated inheritance of the succession of generations preceding them, leading to a division in the person between an archaic and a modern self. The former, the archaic self, as a survival of all the past that had been accumulated in the person through the mechanisms of inheritance, and the latter, the modern self, as being shaped by the impress of the present and as pulling away from, as being in tension with, the archaic self. This division comprised a distinctive new historical fold in the makeup of the modern person, in quotes, with evolutionary museum displays operating on this fold in various ways. To offset the restraining influence of inherited past, for example, or to project the connections between the past and the present forward into the future in the form of an unending evolutionary continuum that resonated with contemporary conceptions modernist conceptions of progress. If this conception of character thus operated as an aspect of a new politics of truth, it was one that only applied to white European and American liberal subjects. Viewed as being endowed with the capacity for self-development that accounted for their having liberated themselves from their archaic pasts, such subjects were differentiated from those racialized others who were said to be still stuck and were interpreted as visible reminders of such, the title of my book, Paths Beyond Memory. This differentiation played a crucial role in distinguishing the functioning of museums in metropolitan and colonial contexts. Engaging with the latter, the operation of museums in colonial contexts, required a shift in the focus of analytical attention from that associated with the concept of the exhibitionary complex, as I'd earlier discussed it. Since this limited attention to the ways of governing conduct that museums are able to exercise through their exhibition practices, whether directly on their visitors or indirectly on the wider publics they reach through the circulation of representations via the newspapers based on their collections. It neglected how museum practices are connected to processes of governance that affect colonized populations through their operations via a completely different set of networks. Considerations of this kind are writ large in settler colonial contexts, where indigenous peoples, I'm talking now about the 19th and early 20th centuries, who by and large may never have heard of or visited museums, were nonetheless profoundly affected by the influence that museum orderings of the relations between peoples exercised on the classificatory grids through which programs of colonial administration were organized. These are questions which concern less how museums cultivate particular dispositions among museum-going publics and the forms of power they bring to bear on racialized bodies. This requires a different analytic optic focused on the connections between museums and other means for collecting information from and about racialized populations in order to identify the classificatory grids and frameworks informing those collections help to shape the varied forms of biopolitical governance brought to bear back on those populations. So it was really attracting my interest was the role of museums as the primary institutional location for late 19th and early 20th century anthropology that was most consequential here in authorizing a wide range of anthropological techniques for collecting data from colonized peoples, data on skin color, skull size, perceptual abilities, and so on, and thereby fueling conceptions of the primitive that played such a major role in racially discriminatory forms of colonial rule. Whereas the accumulating legacies of biological, social, and cultural evolution were said to have produced complex inner depths in the character and culture of white Europeans, primitives were viewed as the product of various forms of biological, social, and cultural, what I call flatlining, stuck in the ruts that marked their original, but one and only moment of differentiation from nature. What the anthropologist Edward Bernard Tyler called, they were said to manifest what the anthropologist Edward Bernard Tyler called the persistence of the useless. These conceptions, I think, though it might be hard to think of this, took a more severe form in Australia than in most other colonial contexts. Their consequences in relation to Australia's developing museum sector were most marked by the fact that until well into the 20th century, Australian archaeological practices rarely conducted any excavations. They never dug underground to find out what primitive life was like, because it was assumed that since there had been no change, everything was the same. So the evidence of the past was constantly available on the surface. The concerns that these questions opened up for me are ones that fed into a collective project, a co-authored study, Collecting, Ordering, Governing, Anthropology, Museums and Liberal Government. I won't go into detail on this, but it was a project looking at the relationships between various practices of government and the links between anthropology and museums in New Zealand, the US, France, Britain, and so on, with the great team of collective researchers from whom I learned stacks. In the course of this study, and I'm now transiting to sort of like work I've done more recently, in the course of this study, I got interested in the concept of culture as a territorially grounded way of life, a concept that was developed within the tradition of American anthropology led by Franz Boas, and I got interested not just in the concept, but in the political role of the concept of culture as a territorially grounded way of life had played in mid-20th century assimilationist policies in the US. This led subsequently, in a couple of essays included in the book Museums, Power and Knowledge, to what's been an ongoing interest for me in the politics of truth constituted by the role that what I'm going to call somewhat clumsily the country-culture couplet. That is, by which I mean indigenous conceptions of the relations between indigenous countries, different indigenous countries and their cultures. I've been interested in the politics of truth constituted by the role that this couplet plays in Australian public life, where it now operates as a distinctive political actor oriented to reshaping the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. While museums have given a number of distinctive forms to this couplet, their role needs to be placed in the context of that couplet's broader political career. So I'm going to say a few words about this first. This is most evident in the role that invocations of Indigenous culture now play in welcome to country ceremonies. These take many forms, ranging from performances of country-specific ceremonial forms of dance and music through to tales of country culture connections narrated by elders appointed to officiate at such occasions. Such ceremonial welcomes are distinctively contemporary forms shaped by the spaces of public interaction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in which they take place. There are some connections to the pre-invasion Indigenous ceremonial forms through which strangers coming into country were both welcomed and subjected to various processes of purification to ensure that they would not be a danger to the country they were visiting, nor it to them. The predominant current form of the welcome to country is that of a welcoming to a public whose members, while meeting on Indigenous land, have come together for some other purpose, a lecture like this, for example, than that of visiting the country in question. This is a very recent development in Australian public life, first introduced in 1998. It wasn't until then that this began to happen. Since then, welcome to country ceremonies have multiplied and now regularly take place across all Australian parliaments, official meetings of government bureaucracies, events hosted by universities and organisations across the public cultural sector, and major sporting events, for example. I couldn't tell whether a welcome to country was given here tonight because my French wasn't good enough, but it would have been in Australia. Not only that, the country culture couplet, what I'm calling this country, now has a massive presence across all aspects of Australian culture. It's massively present in TV series, in films, children's literature, and novels. It's really, really prominent. Again, a personal anecdote on this. I worked in Australia from the mid-80s through to 1998. And in 1998, which is when these ceremonies first began to take place, but I hadn't noticed it, I went back to work in the UK for 10 years. And when I came back, you could see this, this is something that changed. So it really kind of it hit me in the face. So what I'm just saying is that this couplet then has come to play a prominent and historically distinctive role in Australian public culture. But I stress here that my interest is in the role this couplet plays in Australia's public culture by way of distinguishing my concerns from those focused on the distinctive meanings which relations to country have for Indigenous Australians. For Indigenous cultural theorist Eileen Morton Robinson, Indigenous belonging to country is ontological, constitutive of indigeneity as such, and as such is distinct from and incommensurable with both settler belonging based on the illegal dispossession of Indigenous land and from migrant belonging based on the fluidity of the diasporic and its claims to be post-colonial. The ontological relationship to country, she argues, produces a distinct subject position anchored in the role played by ancestral beings in connecting natural creatures and the environment to what she calls the Aboriginal way of life, a moral code for its social institutions and patterns of activity. So I'm just saying here there are things that the country culture couplet means to Indigenous peoples that I don't try to access, I can't access directly. What I'm interested in is how this is being used in the public space as a mode of interaction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So my concerns are focused on what is involved in this couplet and the relations between land, nature, and Indigenous ways of life that it represents, is put into play as a means of reshaping non-Indigenous values and identities, and thereby the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in contexts where the couplet is shaped by a distinctive politics of truth, constituted by a complex set of interactions between both Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledges and agents. So what role have museums played in these processes? Well, I'll take my point of entry into this question from the Hall of the Northwest Coast Indians that was installed at the American Museum of Natural History in 1904 during Franz Boas's tenure as the curator of the museum's anthropological collection. This shows cedar bark being shredded and hung to dry, the implements needed for the shredding operation, the repair of fishing nets, salmon baskets in the background, a young child in a hanging cradle with cedar bark bedding, the gender division of labor between the woman shredding the cedar bark and the man beating it, the placing of the child next to the women and at some distance from the man. In these ways, the relations between the artifacts and the mannequins integrate the former into specific uses that evoke a particular way of life with its distinctive internal divisions, patterns, and forms of adaptation to a geographically specific natural environment. There are many aspects of this display that have been extremely controversial, but the two aspects of the culture concept informing this display I want to stress are first, the contention that each culture is characterized by a specific pattern or style, which integrates all of the elements which it brings together into a distinctive way of life, an aesthetic ordering of a way of life. And second, the anchoring of such ways of life in distinctive territories, an aspect that was given a name, culture areas, by Clark Whistler, who was Boas's successor at the American Museum of Natural History as the person in charge of its anthropological collections. And a concept that was given a distinct cartographic form in the mapping practices, in this map, the map of the Plains Indians culture area, in mapping practices that allowed Indigenous cultures to be kind of like visualized in Western mapping practice terms. So I mention Whistler because of the role that he played in translating a version of the Boasian culture concept into the Australian context. Whistler's version of the culture concept, stressing the very tight anchorage of Indigenous ways of life in and to particular territories, was one which Boas and the other Boasians qualified in also recognizing the significance of cultural flows across territorial boundaries. This now is also a feature of those interpretations of the country-culture couplet within Australia, which stress both the distinctiveness of the relations to culture practiced by different Indigenous groups within the same country, so that, country culture is not uniform, and also the significance of flows and identities and practices across different cultures. They're not hermetically sealed off from one another. There's interactions between them. There's a further difference, not just from Whistler, but also from the Boas and Boasian tradition more generally, in that Indigenous conceptions of culture as regional cultural ecologies, which in contrast to the nature-culture divisions which characterize the intellectual traditions of Western modernities, fold animal, human, and plant life and environments into an indivisible whole in the contemporary version of country-culture concepts. This it's not going to catch on, this term, is it? I can see. But with those qualifications in mind, and they're important ones in terms of the current organization of Indigenous conceptions of the relations between country and culture, there are nonetheless clear lines of connection between Whistler's work and the cartographic practices that fed into this. The Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies map of Indigenous Australia, first produced in 1996. This is quite late. When I came back to Australia in 2009, I went around a lot of museums, and this was everywhere. This was kind of just everywhere in pretty much every museum that I went in. So this is now widely used as a means of stressing the country-specific connections of their Indigenous collections and exhibitions. Just as a point of interest, what's each of these things represents a different area of Indigenous country. it's a nationalized, it's overall placed within a national framework. But there are no internal political divisions associated with colonizing powers in here. There are no state boundaries marked. Now, I'm interested in this because I went to the McCord-Stewart exhibition this morning, and the state boundaries are clearly marked, and indigenous countries are located within them, not as transcending them or contesting them. But this map has a complex history. The Macquarie Atlas of Indigenous Australia traces its relationship back to the maps produced by the anthropologist Norman Tyndale, who from the late 1930s through to the 1970s used techniques that he'd borrowed from Whistler to show the distribution of Aboriginal tribes in Australia. That's not particularly clear, but the whole thing is, there are different dividing lines dividing different areas of country. These maps reflected the influence of Whistler, who visited Australia and worked with Tyndall in the 1930s. But in noting connections of this kind, the Macquarie Atlas is also careful to qualify them, noting that while Tyndale's map was premised on the supposition that there were well-defined tribes clearly separated from one another on different tracts of land, which he bounded with solid lines, the Horton map, the IATSIS map that I showed earlier, charts the relations between larger language groups, social and national groups, and indicates more hazy boundaries as a recognition of the connections between Indigenous Australians operating across different countries. Okay, so this map, the IATSIS map, the Australian Institute of Torres Strait Islander Studies map that I showed, shows Indigenous people connected to particular areas of land, but also is stressing interactions. The Atlas also acknowledges the longer history and continuing influence of the different ways in which relations to culture and country have been represented within Indigenous mapping practices that have both interacted with and been at odds with Australian mapping practices. Just as an example here from the Indigenous artist Josephine Mick's Seven Sisters songline. This is showing kind of like the flow of a particular songline and particular myths, kind of like across and diffusing through Australia without regard to either formal political boundaries or without regard to not being hemmed in by divisions between specific Indigenous countries. The political significance of the hybrid mapping practices represented by the IATSIS map, just going back to that one again, consists in their overturning of the trend dominant from the late 19th century within anthropology and Australian intellectual culture more generally, to completely align the significance of particular country culture and relatedly of country nation sovereignty claims in favor of generalized depictions of the primitivism and so-called nomadism of Indigenous peoples and cultures. All right, so that was the 19th, early 20th century legacy was that a nomadic backward people without any specific kind of like sovereignty claims or specific cultures. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that was the main. Parallel tendencies in archaeology have also been important in providing a Western complement to Indigenous understandings of the deep time of country and ancestry and emphasizing its spatial variations. Billy Griffith, an Australian historian, in his book Deep Time Dreaming, Uncovering Ancient Australia, thus notes how archaeology from the late 1950s onwards, it wasn't until the 1950s that archaeologists began to dig under the surface of the ground in Australia. Archaeology from the late 1950s onwards has pushed Australian deep time back progressively so that the Australian landscape is now recognized as cultural as much as natural, imprinted with stories and lore and shaped by the hands and fire sticks of thousands and generations of Indigenous men and women. So my main point then here concerns the processes through which the country culture couplet, as currently figured in the public sphere, like you want to qualify that, has been forged by an ongoing and clearly mutating set of interactions between and sometimes strategic fusions of Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledges. I call this couplet a governmental actor by way of signalling the role it has played in the practices of state agencies like museums and art galleries, which in responding to Indigenous critiques and activism, and indeed, of course, increasingly including within them Indigenous curators and so on, have accorded a significant role to the couplet as a means of reconfiguring the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. The couplet, it is important to add, played scarcely any role in Australian museum practices prior to the 1990s, nor was it an especially significant aspect of Indigenous political activism in the 1960s and 70s, which drew mainly on the transnational forms and discourses of Black consciousness associated with the civil rights movement. And I say Black there with a C in it, not B-L-A-K, but Black, and I'll come back to that one. Yet, the country couplet is now virtually omnipresent across the Australian museum sector. The example I discuss in Museums Power Knowledge is that of the 2015-16 Encounters exhibition at the National Museum of Australia. Jointly curated by Indigenous and non-Indigenous anthropologists, this drew on the narratives of relations to country being disturbed by diverse aspects of colonialism and white Australia policies, but then being repaired as members of the stolen generation, those forcibly separated from both family and country, have rediscovered and returned to their ancestral homelands. But it applied this narrative, it took this narrative and applied it to the stolen objects constituted by the Aboriginal collections of the British Museum, presenting these as being restored to their true meaning and being exhibited in the countries from which they had been involuntarily removed through various acts of colonial plunder. Sorry, to be clear, this exhibition was one in which everything was on display were Aboriginal artifacts that still belong to the British Museum. The British Museum had loaned them temporarily to the National Museum of Australia. They were stolen, they'd come back temporarily, but then there was a big debate about, well, why are they going to go back to the British Museum? So presenting these objects then as being restored to their true meaning and being exhibited in the countries from which they've been involuntarily removed. This was then an exhibition rhetoric that drew on the logic of Boris's display of the culture of the Northwest Coast Indians in its depiction of a spatially anchored way of life, while also rendering it a distinctive political inflection through the narrative of the separation of the objects of display, their separation from, and their restoration to that way of life anchored in country. In a more recent example, also at the National Museum of Australia, although forgive me, I've forgotten the title of this exhibition, the orientation is a different one of making non-Indigenous Australians feel at home in country. Here we go. The main notice for the exhibition, I don't know whether you can read this, stresses the uniqueness of Indigenous relations to country. The immersive form of the exhibition, in which a range of notable Indigenous artworks depicting different aspects of country were projected onto the walls and floor of the exhibition, was one which enticed visitors into a range of informal ways of participating in country, like this. The country's Indigenous country is all around you. It's on the floor. It's on the walls. Participating in country, playing, dancing, and so to speak, being adopted by country. Well, then there is a distinctive politics of truth invoked by the country culture couplet. It is also a contested one. The welcome to country form has, for example, been criticised within Indigenous debates. It has raised concerns regarding its tendency to empower rural over urban forms and claims to Indigenous authority, and for placing too much emphasis on practices that have been validated as Indigenous forms of high culture rather than contemporary forms of everyday Indigenous culture. It's also been criticised as a form of tokenism, and one that has now become so routinized, some would say, as to lose any critical force it might once have had, and that does little to address the continuing inequalities and injustices between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. This was a point made by Indigenous artist Daniel Boyd in his reworking of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies map. It takes this map as its basis, but it underlines the limitations of the symbolic aspects of Indigenous claims to sovereignty, culture, and culture, in writing over these the conception of Australia as a treasure island, whose resources are to be exploited for the benefit of all Australians, except its original inhabitants. The use of the symbolic aspects of country and allocating resources to country are still two different things, given the persistence of abject living conditions for many Indigenous Australians who have much lower rates of life expectancy, higher rates of imprisonment, and lower rates of literacy and education than other Australians. And these are issues that are very much to the fore in the current debates over the referendum to establish an Indigenous voice to Parliament. I take it you know about this a bit, yeah? There's a debate going in Australia at the moment about there will be a referendum conducted later this year about whether there should be established a voice to Parliament to which exclusively Indigenous representatives will be elected through mechanisms yet to be determined entirely, that will have the right to advise Parliament and the executive on issues specifically affecting Indigenous Australians. There is a for campaign for this. There is an against campaign that includes a significant Indigenous component. It's opposed by some leading figures of the Black sovereignty movement, Black here, BLAK, this is Black as in not transgenerational Black, but Black as specifically Indigenous. It's dismissed as something likely to be purely symbolic. Senator Jacinta Napijinpa-Price, who is the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, is a leading figure in the No campaign, rejects welcome to country ceremonies at public events as being meaningless. She says, I personally have had more than my fill of being publicly recognized. There's a complicated politics. There are more intricacies to the political career of the country culprit than I can go into here. So what I want to do now in concluding is to try to bring together the threads of the argument I've been developing by relating them to the two probes into the relations between museums, governance, and the politics of truth that I offered at the start of my presentation by drawing on the work of Josephine Berry and Susan Ballard. The question I want to put in relationship to Berry is to ask what light her argument about the historical development of art as a sensible milieu that provides for distinctive ways of acting on systems of thought, feeling, and conduct might throw on the place that is now accorded Indigenous art within the contemporary Australian gallery complex. My sense is that contemporary Indigenous art practice is focused on the relations between culture, and ancestry, have at least a double, albeit related, political resonance in the gallery sector. Their role, on the one hand, as a means of constructing a counter-history that reasserts the Indigenous identities and values ruptured by colonial histories, and on the other hand, their role in redefining the relations between country, culture, and nation as a means of remediating the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. But exactly whose thought, feeling, and conduct is connected with and acted on in this way? And this is a question that, putting Foucault to one side for the moment, I want to look at through the optic provided by the work of Pierre Bourdieu. In looking at what he calls Australia's extended art exhibitionary complex, the art historian Terry Smith stresses the significance of the seemingly unstoppable multiplication of the range of venues in which works of art are now exhibited. Museums of modern art, national art galleries, museums of contemporary art, regional art galleries, commercial galleries, biennials, art fairs, Kunsthallen, period museums, universal history of art museums, alternative art venues, Indigenous art centres, public art and street art, for example. The challenge, given such a diverse range of art institutions, is not to look for a political logic common to all of them, but rather to look closely at how different sections of the extended exhibitionary complex operate. And this involves looking at changes in their relations to other exhibition institutions. At least it does for me. There has, for example, been a significant change in the social reach of the international venues for arts exhibitions over the post-war period. Between the 1851 Great Exhibition in London and the 1937 World's Fair in Paris, art was an integral component of world fairs, exhibited alongside displays of industry, manufacturing, and technology. The subsequent post-war development of biennales and art fairs, international art fairs, by contrast, has been marked by the increased separation of the institutions of global art from other forms of exhibition practice. International exhibitions of art, and what are now called expos, heirs to the world fairs, now go mostly in separate directions. Biennales, for example, are focused mainly on new art practices. They don't include much about industry or anything else. Expos no longer typically have any major exhibitions of art. This autonomy of the global contemporary of art has led to a significantly and more restricted public. The international exhibitions of the early 20th century attracted mass publics. 50 million people visited Paris's 1901 Exposition Universelle, a key institutional site for the launching of Art Nouveau, while 31 million people visited the 1937 Paris World's Fair, where Picasso's Guernica was exhibited in the Spanish Pavilion. By contrast, the largest attendance reported by the Biennale Foundation is 905,000 at Documenta 2012. That's a big change. It's not just the lower numbers that matter here, owing to the significance of biennales and art fairs in the operation of contemporary art markets. A good many of those who attend them are people closely associated with art markets in their professional capacities as artists, curators, dealers, critics, art theorists, and so on. Their social reach is thus considerably attenuated. Similar issues bear on the gallery sector in Australia, with significant implications to who is reached by the attention accorded the country culture couplet in its exhibition practices. The findings of a national survey of cultural tastes of 1,461 Australians, conducted as a part of what was called the Australian Fields Research Project, and synthesized in this book, Fields, Capitals, Habitus, Australian Culture, Inequalities and Social Divisions, throws some light on these issues. The couple of issues that I want to highlight from this table are, first, the relative high rate of those who never visit art galleries. Roughly a third of the population, and the people who don't go to art galleries are almost entirely from the working classes, and the particularly low rates of participation in contemporary art galleries, art festivals, and biennales. And the second concerns the relatively high rate of liking for Aboriginal art as a genre, and second, for Albert Namatjira as the most liked Australian artist. Now, you might take good hope from that, but when these things are looked at more closely, and when these art preferences are put together with positive engagements with and liking for other Indigenous items in the survey, we asked about 12 Indigenous items in all, then a distinctive pattern emerges in which such positive engagement with Indigenous culture is tilted toward tertiary educated women in professional occupations with predominantly Anglophone backgrounds. And these things will play out in the politics of reconciliation. They're already playing out the distribution of different constituents of engagement with Indigenous culture. They're already playing out in the referendum, in terms of the voice, the movements that are appealing to oppose the referendum, to oppose the establishment of a voice to Parliament, but ones that appeal to they're much likely to appeal to kind of like working class constituencies, rural constituencies. Having briefly doffed my Foucauldian hat for the sake of highlighting issues concerning the social patterns of participation in art institutions, I want to put it back on again in turning to the issues raised by Susan Ballard's description of the dead dingo that she takes from Deborah Birdrose's Wild Dog Dreaming. In evoking this image to urge the need for a planetary aesthetics capable of engaging with the inextricable interconnections between all forms of life and their environments, Ballard's purpose is to explore how contemporary art practices and institutions might engage with the increasing threat and presence of socio-environmental catastrophes. These are now widely canvassed concerns across the museum and gallery sectors, and with good reason. But there's good reason too to be cautious about some of the terms in which such issues are posed. And I have in mind here especially the frequent invocation of the concept of resilience as an attribute that museums, and sometimes especially regional and community museums, are now often called on to cultivate in order to equip individuals and communities with the capacities required to withstand, adapt to, and come through catastrophes. This might have some virtues in particular contexts. Having lived through a couple of years in which Australia has been subjected to an unprecedented deluge of severe floods, with devastating consequences for many townships, the need for collective and individual forms of resilience has been considerable, and productive museum displays have been arranged in those connections. I was struck today by going to the McCord Stewart Museum, Indigenous Voices of Today, Knowledge, Trauma, Resilience, the functioning of resilience in that exhibition, which has quite different connotations, I think, from the ones that that I've been familiar with. But even in such contexts, it's not clear that the term references the same thing. To reference relatively short-term adjustments to natural catastrophes introduced by floods at the moment doesn't seem to me to belong in the same territory as the form of resilience exhibited by indigenous people over kind of like hundreds of years of colonialism. What is it that put these things together? And what is it that puts them together when we also know that markets can be resilient? Well, industries can be resilient. There's nothing that can't be resilient. All right, so this is a kind of like a buzzword that needs to be handled gingerly. So the concept of resilience has had a much more checkered political history and still does so. And this is something that a number of Foucauldian theorists have commented on in noting how, since its origins in the 1970s, resilience has come to be the dominant paradigm for the biopolitical governance of the relations between different forms of life and environments. In contrast to earlier governmental paradigms in which stability furnished the normative ideal of an equilibrium that was to be restored if disturbed, the problem of resilience shifts the focus of attention to one concerned with how to foster the adaptive capacities that might support trajectories of resilience in the face of volatile and ongoing, recurring ecological catastrophes. The downside to this arises from the ways in which the discourse of resilience is now mobilized by neoliberal strategies designed to foster the emergence of new markets and opportunities for capital. When incorporated into the policy agendas of states and the calculations of corporations, these connections between adaptability and the dynamics of resilience often translate into strategies for the flexible accumulation of capital across recurrent crises through the invention of new financial instruments, environmental derivatives, for example. This runs the risk that rather than being something to be avoided, crisis is valued as a spur to innovation and an opportunity for marketization that is to be cultivated, no matter what the consequences for particular collectives. So this is a note on which I want to conclude as a means of highlighting the need for museums and programs in museum studies to be wary of and to engage critically with the politics of truth and the practices they gave rise to, associated with concepts that are derived from the broader economic and political discursive environments in which they operate. Thank you for listening.